to our latest and greatest Luminari event. Thank you so much for coming. What we'll do now is I will introduce our speaker, Nicole, and then we'll hop right into it. So, Nicole grew up in a town called St. George in the southwestern corner of New Brunswick, and she graduated from the University of New Brunswick. She began her career as a staff accountant and then as a controller at Ganong Brothers, which is a family-run confectionery company. And I guess the little-known fact is that apparently they released the first chocolate bar in North America, right? Yeah. So that's pretty cool. In 2007, Nicole left Ganong for her first investment role at the New Brunswick Innovation Foundation. And over the next few years, she held progressive roles there and at the First Angel Network in Nova Scotia. She also ran her own fractional CFO business, so she operated as a part-time CFO for several young startup companies. In 2014, Nicole began her role as the Director of Strategic Investment at the Business Development Bank of Canada, which is otherwise known as BDC. At BDC, she also ran the Women in Tech initiative. And finally, earlier this year, Nicole joined Sidewalk Labs as their Director of Investments and Partnerships. And so just to end off the bio, despite being a Maritimer, she's apparently a really big Blue Jays fan, which actually says a lot. We have a lot to be proud of because apparently the Jays are more exciting than all of the MLB teams in the Maritimes. So we've really scored on that one. Yeah? Okay, I'm getting a couple of laughs. Somebody gets it, right? Yeah, okay. So, without further ado, if everybody could just give a warm round of applause for Nicole. Let's get going. So, I think is this really loud? Is it just me? No? Good? Okay. I think given all of us are CPAs here, or at least the majority of us are CPAs here, and one of the things that I hear from a lot of our speakers that end up going in like a non-traditional path is that they never planned it that way. So I want to just start the conversation going back to if you can remember a time when you were a traditional accountant and making that move, like how does a traditional accountant, a controller at a candy company in New Brunswick, how does that person become a venture capitalist?
So that is true, and it's really true of venture capital. So if you talk to anybody that's in venture, nobody ever grew up thinking they were going to be a venture capitalist. So I actually moved from my hometown to Fredericton, the big city of Fredericton. And it was a big decision for my husband and I to move to this big city. And he was going back to school. And I was talking to a recruiter and, applying to a bunch of jobs. And learning about venture capital, it was just a chapter in a book from university, that I barely remembered and didn't really understand what it was. Dragon's Den was on television, so that was kind of helpful, so people would kind of understand it's like Dragon's Den, but we don't have a Kevin, we're really nice, and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of how I would explain it to people after I figured out what it was myself. And so it was a bit scary because, accounting, it's as you know, it's very straightforward in the sense that there are rules and you have monthly and quarterly activities and things like that. And then coming into venture capital, as I'm talking to this venture firm, I say, well, there's a checklist, and then it becomes very obvious if we should make the investment or not, and here's yes, 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 or no, 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 and it's very straightforward, and they're like, yeah, sure, that's exactly what it's like. And so then I got there and realized it's completely not like that at all. They were just teasing me, and it's very, very subjective, and depending on the stage you're investing at, it becomes very obvious if this is a good opportunity or not, and then sometimes, has a lot to do with the qualitative factors that have nothing to do with the financial analysis. And going into an early stage company, often if they had revenue, it certainly was very lumpy, and there was no way you could run any sort of, very structured analysis on it. So definitely very different I almost felt like I was starting over again because, working my way through accounting for the first, half of my career, it was very straightforward and, learning new things, and, you would basically just start to take over activities from, your superior or your existing, activities would get a bit more robust, or you get to do more files and things like that. Whereas venture capital, was, just completely unique every single time, and really I guess the process is quite consistent for analysis, but the content is different every single time.
Great, and I think one of the things that you mentioned about going in as a finance person is that you actually spent a lot more time with the portfolio companies, a lot of times because they needed help on the finance side. And I'm just wondering how you think maybe that and your CPA background may have colored the way that you invest as a VC. Do you find that you have kind of a different perspective because of that than some of the other VCs that you've worked with?
Yes, and I think that, for those of you that don't have a lot of exposure to venture capital, is that with venture funds, it certainly does take a team because everybody has a different lens. And, often you get in these investment committee meetings, and unless you're shouting at each other about how much you love or hate this company, it's probably not worth investing. If everybody agrees, it's probably actually not a good investment. So it is very interesting to see how different people look at the same opportunity given all of the same information. And so I certainly would gravitate towards the numbers because that was easy for me, whereas somebody with maybe a more technical background, it's something that doesn't come easy to them, so they're a little bit more intimidated by it, so they leave it until the end, or they ask other people to help them with that. So I certainly did gravitate towards a lot of those things and really trying post-investment to help a lot of these companies with that model. And I think I've mentioned to you a couple of different stories. There was one company, and I had to go in, and they were using Simply Accounting, and I had to go back and do 2 years worth of their financials because they'd made an error and nobody could seem to find it, and they couldn't afford to pay an accountant to actually do it. So I said, okay, your bank statement was basically 1 page for the entire first year of your operation, so I think I can handle this. So I basically reconciled an entire year's worth of activity in about 3 hours. And so then I helped move them forward, and they thought that was a huge value add, and it really only took me a day, and it wasn't that difficult because I think for the exact reason you exist, a lot of companies or people without a finance background they're very intimidated by numbers and they ignore it, and then it kind of just snowballs into this huge problem. So if you have an investor or you have an advisor, they can kind of play that role early on, just take the reins, and because that's what I ended up doing, and it was very, very helpful versus, but I could not really help them with their sales strategy or their product development roadmap or things like that. I now know just enough about that to be dangerous, but I think that, there's a lot of people that have an engineering background and could tell them the difference and have a very, detailed technical conversation with them that I certainly couldn't, so it really takes a whole team. And it's really interesting. In venture capital, you have a lot of people that either have an engineering degree with an MBA, or you have people that have come up kind of through the finance and maybe they've done a business degree in a CPA or a CFA. So you kind of often get these two teams where it works really well together.
Great, yeah. I mean, I look at some of the problems that I see in a lot of early stage companies, and quite frankly, that was some of the philosophy behind our placement program, where we said, look, there are all these engineers that are building amazing things, but a lot of times they don't have access to the kind of financial skill set that they need. And it sounds like you were playing that role in a lot of your portfolio companies, which a lot of VCs actually don't. There's a lot of talk of smart money, but a lot of times you don't actually get that kind of hands-on help. So that's really neat.
It was also very early stage, so it was fairly straightforward to do. Once you get a company that actually has millions of dollars in revenue, they need an entire team to do it. But as an early stage investor, it's actually kind of fun. And I miss doing a journal entry every now and then. At first, when I kind of moved over to venture, I haven't done one in 10 years, so I'm okay with it now. But at first, it kind of brought back a little nostalgia.
That's definitely the first time we've heard that one before. So, hands up, who misses doing journal entries? Oh, you're alone in that group. I wanted to jump over to your time now at BDC, because this is when you kind of got, I would say, more established, as a venture capitalist. So if you could just explain to the room, you managed the Strategic Investment Fund. Can you just tell us a little bit about that fund and what you did there, and maybe some of the companies or the types of companies that you would invest in?
Yes, so BDC Capital is kind of a subsidiary of BDC. So a lot of you probably know BDC as the Small Business Bank of Canada. They work with probably many of your clients or your companies and things like that. And so the venture capital arm actually has 5 different funds. So investing in IT companies, healthcare companies, IT, clean tech, healthcare, those 3 sectors. And then they have a fund of funds group that invests in other venture capital funds, because Canada still has much less venture capital than our neighbors to the south, even on a per capita basis. New York deployed more venture capital than all of Canada did last year. And so my group was the Strategic Investments Fund, and basically looking at more of the early stage funds and early stage companies and making investments in those. So by the time I joined, the program had already been established, and there may be a handful, maybe 20 or so, 30 companies had been invested in. And then over the 4 years, I worked with the team. The portfolio is up to probably almost 200 companies now, and writing smaller checks, $150,000, $250,000, and then working with the portfolio companies, having to triage a lot. So, a small team, it's not possible to manage that many companies in the way you normally would with a venture capital fund, where the average person has 5 to 7 companies they manage, and they share, on a monthly basis with the rest of the team, looking for input, things like that. But obviously, that's a much higher number. So, really working to prioritize and figure out exactly where we could help companies and where we couldn't. But it was a lot of fun. So, from a smaller investment perspective, all geographies, all sectors in Canada, and so really got a great cross-section of the different kind of tech ecosystems, mostly Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Kitchener, Waterloo, and then Atlantic Canada. Edmonton and Calgary starting to kind of evolve now that the oil prices have been a little more fluctuating, and really trying to look at tech innovation. So I think that's there to stay in that ecosystem, but really getting to see the difference between some of the more mature markets and what types of companies and the problems they were facing versus some of the early markets, and then seeing how you could kind of bring some of those, just like a little bee going from flower to flower, kind of sharing that knowledge. And so that was a really, really great experience for me.
Well, something that I was surprised by as I got to know what BDC is more is you kind of hear, a Development Bank of Canada and you think, government fund, but the way that BDC operated was like any other for-profit VC fund. Did you find that there were any differences with the way the BDC ran versus just any other VC fund, or was that pretty much what it was? It just acted like any other?
So BDC has an ecosystem building lens, I would say, to a lot of what they do, and it plays a really important catalyst role in a lot of sectors. So, for example, clean tech, there's not a lot of clean tech venture in Canada because it takes a long time to get a payback. The average fund is a 10-year life cycle. Sometimes it takes 10 years to get through some of those things. So, BDC could play a big role in some of those areas, and think about unique funding, being able to take a little bit more risk. And, I think that the early stage tech ecosystem was greatly enhanced by some of the work that BDC did, because smaller private funds just can't take that same level of risk, whereas BDC could, and still needing to figure out what that ROI is, but being able to have a little bit of a longer timeline versus maybe a smaller private fund, or even personal angel money. It's a little higher risk. You tend to invest closer to home, so you maybe lose some of that knowledge gained from seeing all the different ecosystems across Canada, because angels tend to, maybe once a year they go to a conference, so being able to share some of that knowledge is quite helpful.
Great. I also wanted to focus in on you were the director of Women in Tech at BDC as well. So I was hoping you could speak just a little bit about what that initiative was like, or is, I should say, what your philosophy around supporting female entrepreneurs is, and what that initiative was doing to support that philosophy.
So one of the things that BDC also felt was important was really targeting, some other groups that were underrepresented. And so, it's really about long-term diversity and inclusion, but women is certainly one that's getting a lot of attention. And so what BDC's focus is they actually, at the time I was leaving, they just closed a fund to invest in companies with women in the C-suite. So a wide range of stage, so early stage, so thinking about kind of the life cycle. It starts with pre-seed, then seed. So seed tends to be a couple of $1 million. You have a product. You might have some revenue, but it's still a little lumpy, all the way through to kind of Series A and B, where the companies are more about scaling, and they've kind of overcome some of those product market fit issues, and they're really thinking about how to grow. And so just really trying to bring that, by having more women in a company playing these roles, and then kind of being leaders in the field, it's then easier to inspire others to also get involved. And I think that the discussion around the CEO and the founder role versus kind of a leadership role is that a lot of women didn't want to be the CEO. They were happy as a CFO or a CMO or a COO or whatever that is. And I think that, in an interim step, we'd love to have more women as CEOs across tech companies in Canada. But, there are lots of women playing really important roles, and especially in later stage companies, the CEO isn't always the most important person, especially as you're scaling and you need to get revenue and you need cash flow and you need to raise additional funding. So really kind of having that broader focus to just get more women in the near term into some of those leadership roles and setting that example and getting others excited about what's going on. So I think that just bringing that diversity changes the whole nature of some of the leadership strategies.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I think actually finance can play a really strong part in, because when you look at actually, and I don't know if this is an actual stat, this is anecdotal, but when I look at all of the various CFOs and finance directors and managers at tech startups that we know, because we happen to just know a lot of those types of people, definitely more common than any other function in a company, it's a female. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the fact that when it comes to the CPA designation, we're actually fairly diverse in that sense, and it's a great way for women to play a more active role in the tech scene, like yourself. So, great. One of the other things I wanted to talk about just before we move on from your time at BDC was you were a VC during the crypto explosion that happened over the past, 2 years it was. Can you just take us into what the attitude was like in the VC community around crypto? Was it excitement? Was it skepticism? Was it how are people feeling about that kind of really huge change and excitement about that industry?
So this wasn't an area I definitely had a background in, but it was certainly something that everybody was starting to talk about. And I think generally people were excited about it and really wanted to understand the implications of what that would mean as a VC investor. So A, do we start taking bets and investing in crypto companies and blockchain companies and things like that? And I would say that there's a number of very fintech focused VCs that are starting to do that. The other thing that it was kind of, especially at the early stage, I didn't see too many early stage companies to make investments in, or ones that had a woman kind of as a founder. But there were definitely, that's over the last couple of years, it's certainly really evolved. The other element was starting to understand the implications on the cap table or as an investor. If a company you've invested in is now going out and doing an initial coin offering or starting to get into some of these cryptocurrencies, how does that affect you? Does that dilute your ownership? How does that affect that cap table? And so really starting to think about that and building some of those things into the term sheets and into the shareholders agreements to make sure that there's not this secondary dream currency kind of floating over here that all of a sudden the company gets acquired and everybody kind of converts that, and what does that do to you? So I think that's one thing that particularly the US investors started thinking about. I guess it was from a US investor that I first saw in a term sheet, but I think most VCs now are starting to really kind of understand how does that fit into some of the deal structures, not just from an investment perspective.
Well, yeah, because I think you hear a lot, and it's something that even played prominently in the last season of Silicon Valley, the only television shows focusing on startup life so far, at least that I know of, is that people sometimes have this view that an ICO is kind of like an alternative to raising money through a VC, and there's various different opinions about VCs being wonderful or terrible or everything in between. Did you find there was a sense in the VC world that this was an alternative, or is this just another kind of tool to add to the kit?
I would say in Canada it was very small. One of the 200 companies actually was seriously considering an ICO. So at the time, like a year ago, so which is a long, long time ago in startup world. So I would say definitely a lot of people are thinking about it instead of raising venture capital from the very beginning. So if I was already into a company, then it really wasn't something, because they had this established network of investors and they knew how to fundraise and things like that. But I think a lot of people are just kind of sidestepping the venture industry and just going that way for now.
Great. So before we go to the next portion of the talk, which is where we'll spend the rest of the talk talking about your time and your role here at Sidewalk, I wanted to do something that we like to do at a couple events. We call it a lightning round. So I've got 5 questions for you. It's intended to get to know you a little bit better, and every question should have a one-word or a one-phrase answer, hopefully. If if I've asked the questions right. But if you're ready to...
Can I cheat and say?
No, that's why I'm lifting this up. So if you're ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so what is your favorite candy or chocolate bar?
Anything Lindt.
Oh, I was going to say, I thought it had to be Ganong, but...
The Palomine's really good. It is.
That's the first chocolate.
And they make Laura Secord, and the mint squares are very good, but Lindt.
Lindt. Okay, fair. What is the most accountant thing about you, other than wanting and missing journal entries?
I have a spreadsheet for everything, including my own personal 12-month rolling cash flow, which my husband, who is an artist, has absolutely no interest in, even though I did make pretty charts with colors and things.
Get him to draw them. Maybe it'd be exciting. What's your least favorite startup buzzword?
Oh, there's many. I would say product market fit.
Yeah, we use that one all the time. Tell us about your inner Luddite. And what I mean by that is like something that you refuse to do in a techie way, even though you're a techie person in general.
I still like to read real books.
It's mine as well. There's nothing like
I do
turning the
have a
pages.
Kobo, and it's great for traveling, but I much prefer real books.
All right, I've been one of those like holdouts. I don't get an e-reader. So this one will be a good transition into the second half of our discussion today, which is what's the most interesting thing that you've learned since starting at Sidewalk Labs, like a little factoid or something that is totally outside of accounting or investing?
So I've learned so many stats, and I know so much about urban planning now. I think I'm an urban planner. No, I'm kidding. It's the same thing. I know just enough to be dangerous. I think what surprised me a lot was around the sustainability and waste area, where 75% of waste in the system currently comes from sort of construction and renovation waste. So you need to keep recycling, but washing my little containers and putting them in the blue recycling bin, how much of an impact is that really having? And really seeing that there are huge amounts of waste in the system that that's one of the reasons that we exist, is to be able to kind of affect change in some of those areas, but tons of stats along those lines. And if you would spend any time at the tall timber exhibit over here, realizing that tall timber and wood is actually more sustainable, stronger, and less expensive than steel buildings. I don't even know if I still believe it, but
yeah, I mean it's definitely like the idea makes sense scientifically, but it's kind of scary, the idea of being in like a 50-story wood building. I don't know. So thank you for that. I think that let us get to know you a little bit better, and we'll want to spend the rest of the talk talking about Sidewalk Labs. So maybe just to give everybody the right context, hopefully they all got a chance to look around and see what Sidewalk's up to, but if you could just give us a sense from a high level of the mandate of the organization. I know you guys are working towards a January deadline. Tell us all about that and what it is and how you're working with the city to I guess, tell us the mission that you're trying to get to as well.
Sure. So I'll give you a bit of an overview of kind of the genesis of this company. So Dan Doctoroff is our CEO, and he has this really unique skill set in that he was deputy mayor of New York and he was CEO of Bloomberg, so truly understands both the tech world and the municipal world. So it's just really interesting that he can kind of have a foot in both of these areas. And so, Google and him were working together, Alphabet, to really think about how do we change the future of urban living and urban life, because in reality, like, there's huge transportation issues, there's affordable housing issues, like all of these things that have drawn us to the city are now sort of making it unlivable. And how can we utilize both a sense of community and a sense of technology to be able to do that? Because historically, it's always been around the social policy and then adding tech in, or it's been around just the tech and then figuring out how to fit in the kind of social policy later. So it's really about working with those two elements from the very beginning. So half of our company have deep technical backgrounds in buildings or mobility or sustainability, urban planning, architecture, design. And then the other half of the company have financial backgrounds, product and engineering backgrounds. And so basically working on these cross-functional teams to put together these this plan that truly solves the problems around urban planning and design and, you know, what will this city of the future be, but then also figuring out what that product roadmap looks like. What's the plan for sustainability? Being backed by somebody like Alphabet, we have the luxury to be mission driven and truly solve these problems and have time to be able to figure these out, but you know, really having this cross-functional group. So going into these meetings around what we're building, you know, I think I told you this, is that, you know, one of the meetings I was at, I was talking about tech and equity, meaning shares, but the other half of the room, it was 10 minutes in before I realized they thought it meant social justice and gender parity. I'm like, this is great, like this warms my heart, but no, we need to figure out how to make money and do these things. So it's really this interesting mix, and neither one of them, you know, has priority, right? It's truly about being mission driven, solving the problem, and then finding that sustainability model that aligns with that. So high level, that's kind of the genesis of, you know, what we're thinking about. And so we're headquartered in New York, and, you know, as we were as Dan and the team were kind of looking at all these different smart city initiatives across the globe, what was working, what wasn't, and, you know, how did it, you know, kind of start, and how was it being rolled out? He said, we need to build a city somewhere. We have all of this really interesting technology that exists in the world. We need to test it out somewhere. So they started looking for a number of locations. Toronto was one of the ones on the list, and when we won the RFP that was put out by Waterfront Toronto, who is our partner here, they're responsible for developing the waterfront, we stopped looking at all our other cities. So this is our only city that we're doing, the entire company. We're a startup. We report directly through to Alphabet. There's only 100 of us, and about 25 or 30 of us are here sitting up in the office, and we are only focused on Toronto. So why we've been a little quiet in the media is that we're in the planning phases. This is a huge, complex problem, and we want to put a lot of thought behind it. So we're working with various community and technology and transportation and building partners, and really putting together this plan. And so in January, we're going to, you know, be releasing this big master innovation development plan, we're calling it. And from that, you'll be able to see what we're thinking in a lot of areas. And we need to take it to Alphabet to be able to get approval, because we're going to be asking, you know, for some money to do this. And then Waterfront Toronto is going to take it through the various levels of government. We want to make changes to building codes for tall timber, autonomous vehicles, so you're actually sitting right now on the street of the future. And so all of the street would be controlled by lights that would speak directly to the autonomous vehicles in transit. So that's kind of the stage that we're at. It's very, very exciting. And you know, this part of the purpose of this building here is to engage with the public, so you can actually leave any thoughts that you have on the wall. Our designer actually goes through and reviews everything and shares that with the entire company. It's open every Wednesday night and Sunday afternoon, so the public can come at any time. And you know, I think we're really excited to see, you know, kind of how this plan comes out, and, you know, moving from planning phase to execution mode.
Great. No, I think that was great context. And, you know, I think a lot of us have seen various things in the news over the past week, and we'll you know, skid over that in terms of the data privacy and everything question. Maybe that's something somebody wants to bring up in the question period. But it's clear to me that, you know, this isn't something that a company can do on its own. It really needs to partner with the city to actually make this a reality, and it seems like that's what you guys have done with Waterfront, right?
Yeah, no, and I don't know, like, if you think about city building, which I hadn't really done before, it's just a very complex problem, and so you really can't do anything in isolation. And if you look at our data and privacy policy that we released 2 weeks ago, you can see that we need it to be an open platform and something that's collaborative. And I would say, you know, my role as, you know, an accountant, I'm not on the finance team, I'm on the investments team. And so really looking for technology companies that we can do a number of things with. A, if it's critical to our development, we could invest in them to ensure they're well capitalized and to make sure their roadmap continues to align with what we need. Two, we could just partner with them because, you know, we like what they're doing. Maybe we can fund some development and make sure that their product is customized to our needs. Or see if it's great and it's exactly what we need, we could just be a customer or have a customer vendor relationship with them. So really looking kind of to still in kind of in a venture role, assess all of those companies, and then if it's not something we're going to invest in, being able to work with the rest of the company to kind of refer them in and really see how we can work with some of these technology companies, because this is a really unique opportunity in the sense that we can be the catalyst for a lot of these discussions. And you know, if you ever hear Dan in any of his speeches, there's a great Freakonomics podcast that he did about 6 months ago. Talks about being this master enabler and really looking at all the technology companies, where maybe some of your companies, they might not be a startup, they might be a bigger company, trying to figure out, what solutions we could deploy here and finding out how to work with some of those companies, because a lot of these things already exist. We actually don't like the term smart city because it's easy for the sake of, talking about it in the community. Everybody knows what a smart city is, but most cities are already smart. And it's about really kind of bringing all these technologies together. If you go over to Japan or Korea, it's amazing the technology they have. Like, there's different, I have a friend that went and you walk into the hotel room, the blinds go up. You leave the hotel, they go down. And so you just walk into your room all day to watch the blinds go up and down. But there's tons of this connectivity that's already out there. It's just a matter of kind of bringing it all together, see how it works together, and finding, those efficiencies that, reduce the cost of living, reduce transportation costs, increase quality of life and happiness because you're no longer commuting, finding ways to reduce energy and, having sustainability goals. So it's pretty exciting to see all of these different elements coming together.
Yeah, it's interesting that you don't actually like the smart city brand because of that. And I do have to say, I went to Japan 10 years ago and I got caught in the first washroom I went in for like 20 minutes. It was like an airplane cockpit in there. They have so many controls. It's wild. Go to Japan. It's really cool. But this is actually a really great segue, not the toilets in Japan part, but the stuff that you were talking about before. In terms of my next question, which is really like what your role is, and you went over a little bit of it, but could you give us a sense of, Director of Investments and Partnerships? It's very broad. Give us a sense of like, what are you doing all day, every day?
So because we're, I wouldn't call us an investments company, we're kind of we're a startup and we are building out a neighborhood here in Toronto. And the investments and partnerships team has a number of roles. So there's actually 3 different types of kind of personas on my team. So one is the people with infrastructure investment experience. The other one is real estate financing, and then tech. And my team is 12 people on it, 6 women and 6 men. I actually think we hired a woman that started today. I actually think the whole company is at 50-50 right now. If not, we're at 49. So it's pretty close, which is a great feat for a technology company. A lot of women are in kind of the urban planning and design background, but anyway, that just an aside, it's very exciting. So people with infrastructure really need to understand, how do we build bridges and build roads, and what technologies can we utilize to really, add this new technology into kind of some traditional infrastructure. So again, this bridge between, old school infrastructure and new crazy tech, and how we can kind of figure out how that works together. We have this physical place where we can test and deploy a lot of that. So those people are talking about much bigger projects than I would ever understand financing for, and they come from, private equity and banking backgrounds, and so they're really interesting to kind of understand, just peripherally in the team meetings, kind of some of the stuff they're working on. Then some of my colleagues also have a real estate financing background, so they're really looking at, I was talking to somebody earlier about that you should see the spreadsheet we have for this development. We're definitely working with an accounting firm to help us with that, but
you're an accountant when you get that excited about a spreadsheet.
And I won't tell you, I think they actually did it in Google Sheets, so I know. So they actually are looking at, kind of that real estate financing model. Not that we're going to invest in like real estate projects, but our own real estate project and kind of building out that. And then the tech team, so looking at kind of, that's where I sit, really trying to figure out, working. So we are a startup, we have products that we need to build. And so what I'm doing is finding technology companies to say, okay, this component of the product we don't need to build because there's a startup doing this, or this larger company is doing this. And so we can basically figure out how to fit in these other products into this product roadmaps. And then we actually only end up having to build a little component of it. So really learning a lot about how a product is actually built. So it's almost, I am working for a startup, and really kind of figuring out then I will structure investments separately as we decide which companies we need to be working with, and which ones are critical to our development, which ones we'll just have, more of a customer-vendor relationship with. But it is definitely very exciting. It's very diverse, learning something new every single day. And kind of one of the things I talked about, with some of my colleagues at, in venture before, is like when I was at BDC, I would meet people, and even now, like I'm meeting people that are top in their field. And so they're 30 years old, they have a PhD in X, and they've accomplished X, Y, Z, and it's just so amazing. And I end up learning this much about it. Like I could talk about quantum computing, I could talk about blockchain, like I know this much about a lot of things. And so it's very exciting when you meet these people, but then after you go home, you're like, man, I've accomplished nothing. Like, look at what these people have done and all of this. But so they're very, very deep, where I'm more broad. And so I think that, you know, it's very helpful in kind of these investment roles, as long as you have a whole team behind you that can kind of do that deeper analysis.
Cool. Well, I don't know if there's any that you are able to share publicly, but are there any of the companies that that are your suppliers, or maybe the people that are making these smart streets, or anybody that you think is particularly neat that people might want to check out?
So there's lots of really cool companies that we're either working with or starting to work with, but it is still very, very early, because we are still in that proposal process that, you know, a lot of the times we meet with companies like, this is super interesting, we really want to continue this dialogue. When we get approval or when we move forward to this next step, we'll really want to start to understand what that looks like. And we are 3 to 4 years away from actually having buildings. So we're right in the middle of this site. I don't know if you saw the map in the back corner, but it basically goes out to the water, down Parliament Slip, and then back towards Chorus, or as far as Sherbourne Street, so just between Lakeshore and this road here, Queens Quay. So it's just an L shape like that. And you know, it's 3 to 4 years before we can actually be those customers and pilot those technologies. So you know, still trying to figure out how to navigate that, and maybe working on other sites or things like that to test some of the technology. So this one here is an Italian company, and it's a mock-up. So this street would actually be made of concrete, but it's very modular. Everything we're looking at has to have flexibility. Because talking earlier about that fact I learned about waste, is that buildings have a life of 40 to 50 years, and they have to tear it down and rebuild it. So if we can extend the life of those buildings, that's less waste into the system. And it also, you know, if we can make that building flexible, then it can continue to extend that life. And really thinking around modular buildings, we're using DC electricity, so low voltage electricity. All of our appliances, the fans and the lights, are all powered right now by DC electricity. So you can stand in a bucket of water and stick your finger in every electronic component and it's fine. It looks like an Ethernet cable. And then you can also, you don't have to have an electrician. You can move walls around, and they can be very modular and panels, and you can actually switch some of those things around. So just understanding the flexibility that certain technologies give you, you know, to actually have, you know, a different type of building layout. And so if you look at, you know, one of our building exhibits over there, you know, one of the things is that you may be 20 and you have a super cool loft, and then you get married and have a couple of kids. You're like, maybe I should have a bedroom or two, so you can kind of take over the space next to you or above you if that person moves out, and just being able to have that flexibility to expand maybe your business, so you can just take over the space next to you and move people around. But that's what this street is all about, is flexibility, and being able, you know, security elements can pop out of the street. I've heard that we could have hockey nets pop out of the street, so kids could play hockey and then they could go back down. We could also heat this street for accessibility, for bikers, those types of things, be able to reduce costs around salt and snow removal. The other one that you probably played with here was generative design, and this is a tool that we've started building, and we're looking for companies that are in this space as well. And so basically this one is just for demonstration purposes, but if you're planning a city, you want to understand the effect of different elements on kind of the outcomes. So, you know, what you can move the knobs around, you know, density, access, like how much green space, visual elements, how tall do you want the buildings. Eventually you can put things like building code or bylaws or economics into that to really understand, you know, from an urban perspective. All of the architects and urban planners that come in always play with that, because they say, like, this is great, like this is what takes me a long time to do now, so something like this can actually help accelerate that.
Citywide sensitivity analysis. So do we have any takers? If we get a pail of water, does anybody want to give it a shot? No? All right. No, it's really neat, because it's a totally, I think for any of us here, this is a totally different world. It's something we don't think about very often, yet at the same time, it's what we live in every day, all day. So it has a huge impact on all of us. We can all understand how this would change our lives. So I wanted to ask about, you know, how I mean, as you mentioned, you haven't done any full investments yet because you're at this early stage, but you're like looking through and considering different companies. How has your investing approach changed in this environment from, you know, being just a general VC that, I guess at BDC you had a little bit of a kind of a how did you say it? You said like economic outlook about how it's changing the Canadian economy in general, but generally speaking, you were going for purely profit motive, whereas in this case, your incentives are a little bit different. So
I would say at BDC, it was like, it was definitely having to make investments with an ROI, but an ecosystem building lens. So definitely the return metrics were different. Here, I'm a subsidiary, Alphabet, we're a subsidiary of Alphabet, so we're a subsidiary of a publicly traded company. So we are, having to drive shareholder value, but the shareholders understand that this is a long-term play. So still having that profit motive, but again, everybody here is very, very mission driven and thinking that if we can truly solve the problems that need to be solved, then we'll be able to kind of build that business model over time with them and find that ROI. And, that really is true. Everybody here is so mission driven, really trying. So it's from my perspective in a VC world, definitely more focused, although urban life is still pretty broad. But initially thinking about our site here, buildings, mobility, and energy, those are the first things you really need to put in the ground and get right. And then after that, you can start to think more about the consumer-facing technologies and things. But having an internal due diligence team, so basically being able to go, so we have 5 pillars, so buildings, mobility, sustainability, community, and then public realm. And so community is also city operations, health, education, working with governments, that sort of thing. And so whenever I meet a technology, I just go to that pillar and say, what do you think about this area? Is this something exciting? Do we want to work with them? And I wouldn't really go forward with due diligence for an investment unless that pillar was on board and said, yes, I'm super excited, this is how we can work with them, and this is what we would do. So it's great to really be able to just to take a deep dive after having one call with a company and not having to kind of wait and tap your network of people that are out there or pay somebody to do that due diligence for you, which some funds, have people that do that for them. I think that it's just really great to have that internal team.
Sure, and it's kind of interesting to think about building a city as a product, right? And having an ROI and a business model and a monetization strategy for a city or a section of a city. Can you take us through just a little bit of how your thinking has changed from, thinking about a software as a service enterprise subscription model compared to we've got a city as a service kind of model here?
And so I really look at companies with a different lens because now it's not always about investing. Sometimes, if I go to an accelerator, so that's often a way that, venture funds, A, contribute to ecosystem building, but B, it's just a great way to kind of, find access and get access to some companies. So looking at that's great. I don't think I want to invest in you, but I definitely want to be your customer. So always having that additional lens is very helpful, I would say, because I can, kind of the Catholic guilt in me always wants to help people. And so this way, sorry, I can't invest in you, but I can get you a contract or we can find a way to work together and, put a pilot. And to be honest, sometimes they actually, are more excited about that than getting investment because revenue is the cheapest form of financing. So.
Non-dilutive financing is always the best. Looking at the role now, if I were to have asked you, a day before you started the job and now, what are the things between that day before you started and now that you didn't realize would be a big part of your role, but ended up being a big part of your role?
So I would say it's that product development and working with kind of the product team. So we're a startup ourselves, so we're definitely emerging. And once the proposal's done, we'll kind of, switch and start to think about pre-planning on execution and things like that. So definitely it feels more of a startup than I thought it would be. So I definitely feel like I work for a startup versus it doesn't feel like a fund.
It's good at least, and it's a startup that can make $1 million decisions rather than our investment decisions are do we Uber or do we bus? I don't.
The answer is always public transit or bicycle.
That's right. I like it, especially on the income statement there. But you had different reasons.
We bike everywhere. We have a bike share out here. Everybody's got everybody bikes everywhere.
Awesome. So when you're thinking about the future now, I want to bring everybody a little bit of, we spoke about a few weeks ago, some of the things that you now think about in terms of how humans will live in the future. One that I remember specifically, it's do we need a drone landing pad on buildings? I mean, these are things that none of us would normally be thinking about. Can you take us through some more of those considerations that are things that just, most of us living our day-to-day lives wouldn't be thinking about, but are really quite impactful for how we might be living our lives in 10, 20, 30 years from now?
So we often get into discussions around what the future of humanity is and how humans will evolve, and it's really, really interesting, and it's definitely not nearly about as much as the tech as, you know, somebody coming in from my angle would be. And so like that's the thing we're thinking about our buildings, is that will they be flexible enough when people no longer travel in cars and they only travel in drone pods or drone taxis, and they land on their balcony or they land on their roof? Is the building flexible enough? We're going to have to tear down the building because it's not going to be cool enough anymore, right? Like we don't want to be necessarily, you know, the kind of the DVD, you know, Blu-ray, you know, nobody has or actually even I don't know, I was thinking CDs actually only had maybe a 10-year life in the 90s, and then because you went from cassettes, you know, right to kind of digital. So, you know, we just want to make sure that whatever we build here isn't that. So really trying to think about building in that flexibility around, you know, even solving a problem. So this is great, this street is great, it would talk to everybody, it would be very safe, you could, you know, alert if there's something happening ahead of time so that people could slow down. Heating the streets reduces costs for snow removal. Hopefully it offsets it evenly. We're working on that now. But if you heat your street so that it's very accessible, where is every homeless person going to be in February? They're going to be on your street. So you've solved one problem, but now you've created another. So now you have to work with, you know, the different departments of social services to make sure that it's not legal to be homeless. So then how do you actually kind of address that problem? And so the same thing with, you know, if you have autonomous vehicles and you don't have a driver who's waiting to get home to their family, or they, you know, don't have another job, you have these ghost cars just driving around and around and around forever, and then actually could increase congestion. So then you have to introduce congestion pricing, and then how do you, you know, so that's what some of the cities in Asia are looking at. So that's just a really interesting component. The second you solve one problem, you may create another, or just, you know, it just becomes this very complex, intertwined component.
Yeah, well, I think it's easy to see when you think about a city and the complexity that a city is, that this many human beings living in this close quarter and doing all the things that we do. It's not too surprising. So I think that's where we'll end the formal part of our chat. First of all, can everybody give Nicole a round of applause? This was wonderful, very enlightening.